Have you ever wondered what it takes to transform a heart hardened by war? What happens when faith collides with fury in the most unlikely of places? When a single song becomes the bridge between hatred and healing? Tonight I'm going to share with you one of the most extraordinary stories to emerge from the Second World War. A story that will challenge everything you think you know about redemption, about the power of music, and about what can happen when human souls encounter something greater than their own pain. This is the story of the Montana prisoner of war chapel of 1944, and the hymn that changed everything for one young German soldier whose name history nearly forgot. But before we dive into this incredible tale, let me tell you why this story matters more than you might think. Hidden in the archives of a small Montana town lies documentation of something that should have been impossible. A moment when enemy combatants and American guards came together in a way that defied every rule of war, every expectation of human behavior during humanity's darkest hour. What happened in that makeshift chapel didn't just change one man's life. It rippled outward in ways that would influence generations. I spent months tracking down this story, piecing together fragments from military records, personal letters, and testimonies that survived decades of neglect. What I discovered was so powerful, so unexpected, that it reads like fiction. But every detail is real. Every moment of transformation, every note of that life-changing hymn, every tear shed in that wooden chapel actually happened. The year was 1944, and America was housing nearly 500,000 German prisoners of war across the continental United States. Most Americans had no idea that enemy soldiers were living and working in camps scattered from coast to coast. These weren't the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. These were facilities governed by the Geneva Convention, places where captured soldiers waited out the war while contributing labor to America's wartime economy. Montana housed several of these camps, and one in particular would become the setting for something extraordinary. Camp Ellis sat in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, surrounded by endless sky and rolling prairie that reminded many German prisoners of their homeland. The facility held nearly 3,000 men, farmers and factory workers, students and teachers who had been swept up in the machinery of war and deposited thousands of miles from everything they had ever known. Among these prisoners was a young man named Klaus Richter. 22 years old, captured during the Battle of Normandy, Klaus carried wounds that went far deeper than the shrapnel scar on his left shoulder. He had grown up in a small Bavarian village where his father served as the local pastor. Klaus had been raised on hymns and scripture, on stories of love conquering hatred and faith overcoming fear. But war has a way of destroying the foundations upon which young men build their understanding of the world. Klaus had seen things that made him question everything his father had taught him about God's love and human goodness. He had watched friends die in muddy trenches. He had followed orders that violated every moral principle he had been raised to honor. By the time he arrived at Camp Ellis, Klaus Richter was a man whose faith had been shattered by the reality of what humans could do to each other. The American guards at Camp Ellis were a mix of older men deemed unfit for overseas combat and younger soldiers recovering from wounds that had brought them home. Among them was Sergeant William Hayes, a Methodist from Billings whose own faith had been tested by letters from the Pacific Theater describing his younger brother's death at Guadalcanal. Hayes had volunteered for guard duty partly because he needed work that felt meaningful, partly because he wanted to understand the enemy that had taken so much from his family. The relationship between guards and prisoners at Camp Ellis was professional but not unfriendly. Geneva Convention rules required humane treatment, and most American personnel took those obligations seriously. Prisoners worked on local farms during harvest season, maintained the camp facilities, and participated in educational programs designed to prepare them for eventual repatriation to Germany. But something was missing from this carefully regulated existence. The German prisoners had been allowed to maintain many of their cultural traditions, including music and literature. They had formed orchestras and theater groups, created newspapers, and held debates. Yet there was one thing that remained forbidden, one aspect of their former lives that American authorities viewed with suspicion. Religious services were technically permitted under international law, but the reality was more complicated. Many camp commanders worried that German military chaplains might use religious gatherings to maintain Nazi ideology among the prisoners. There were concerns that hymns sung in German might contain coded messages or serve to reinforce loyalty to the Third Reich rather than promote genuine spiritual reflection. As a result, most prisoner of war camps provided only the most basic religious accommodations. A visiting chaplain might conduct services once a month. Prisoners could possess Bibles if they were provided by approved religious organizations. But the kind of regular, meaningful worship that many of these men had known in their civilian lives was largely absent from their daily routine. This absence weighed heavily on Klaus Richter, though he would have been hard-pressed to explain why. His faith had been shattered by war, his prayers had gone unanswered when friends died beside him, and his father's teachings about divine love seemed like naive fantasies in a world consumed by violence. Yet something in him longed for the comfort of familiar hymns, for the peace he had once found in Sunday morning worship services in his village church. The idea for a prisoner chapel began with Sergeant Hayes, though he later admitted he wasn't entirely sure what had motivated him to propose it. Perhaps it was his own need for spiritual grounding after his brother's death. Perhaps it was his observation that the German prisoners seemed to carry a particular kind of sadness that went beyond homesickness or concern about the war's outcome. Whatever the reason, Hayes approached his commanding officer in late September with a proposal that seemed almost revolutionary. Hayes suggested that the camp establish a regular worship service that would be open to both German prisoners and American personnel. The services would be conducted in English to address security concerns, but they would incorporate musical traditions familiar to the German prisoners. Most importantly, attendance would be entirely voluntary for both groups, ensuring that no one felt coerced into participating in religious activities that conflicted with their personal beliefs. The commanding officer, Colonel James Morrison, was initially skeptical. Morrison was a career military man who had spent the war years managing the complex logistics of prisoner operations. He understood the delicate balance required to maintain order and security while meeting international obligations for humane treatment. The last thing he needed was a controversy over religious activities that might draw unwanted attention from Washington. But Hayes persisted, and eventually Morrison agreed to a trial period. The chapel services would be held in the camp's recreation hall on Sunday evenings. A local Methodist minister would conduct the services, assisted by Hayes and any German prisoners who wished to participate. The content would focus on universal themes of hope, forgiveness, and redemption, rather than specific denominational doctrines. Most importantly, everything would be carefully monitored to ensure that no security risks emerged from this experiment in interfaith cooperation. Word of the chapel services spread quickly through the camp, generating reactions that ranged from enthusiasm to suspicion to outright hostility. Some American guards saw the services as an unnecessary accommodation to enemy soldiers who deserved no special consideration. Some German prisoners viewed them as a form of American propaganda designed to weaken their resistance to capitulation. But others recognized something different in Hayes's proposal. These men, both American and German, understood that war had damaged something essential in their souls, something that military discipline and Geneva Convention protocols could not address. They sensed that the chapel services might offer a path toward healing that had nothing to do with politics or national allegiance, and everything to do with the universal human need for meaning and connection. Klaus Richter was among the skeptics. When news of the planned services reached his barracks, his initial reaction was one of cynical dismissal. He had seen too much of what humans could do to each other to believe that singing hymns with his captors would accomplish anything meaningful. The God his father had preached about seemed absent from the battlefields, where Klaus had learned what war really meant. Yet something drew him toward that recreation hall on the first Sunday evening in October, when the chapel services began. Perhaps it was curiosity about how Americans would conduct religious worship. Perhaps it was homesickness for the familiar rhythms of Sunday services he had known as a child. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a hunger for connection that had nothing to do with nationality or ideology, and everything to do with the human spirit's refusal to surrender hope entirely. The first service was awkward and tentative, attended by perhaps 20 men total, split almost evenly between guards and prisoners. The Methodist minister, Reverend Thomas Crawford, had prepared carefully for this unusual congregation. His sermon focused on the story of the Good Samaritan, emphasizing how compassion could bridge the deepest divides between people who saw each other as enemies. But it was the music that created the first real moment of connection. Crawford had chosen hymns that were familiar in both American Protestant and German Lutheran traditions. When the small congregation began singing, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," something remarkable happened. The German prisoners joined in, some singing in English, others in their native German, creating a harmony that transcended language barriers and national boundaries. Klaus found himself singing along, his voice joining with those of his fellow prisoners and their American guards in words that had comforted believers for centuries. For the first time since his capture, for the first time since the war began, he felt a flicker of something that might have been peace. The hymn echoed through the recreation hall with a power that surprised everyone present. Klaus felt something stirring in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than memory or nostalgia. These were the same words his father had sung from the pulpit in their village church, the same melody that had filled Sunday mornings with hope before the world went mad. But it wasn't just the familiarity that moved him. It was the sight of Sergeant Hayes, the man who guarded him daily, singing the same words with equal reverence. It was the realization that these Americans knew the hymns of his childhood, that faith had somehow survived the machinery of war on both sides of the conflict. As October gave way to November, the chapel services grew in both attendance and intensity. Word spread beyond Camp Ellis as other prisoner facilities heard about Montana's unusual experiment in wartime worship. Military officials from Washington arrived for unannounced inspections, expecting to find security breaches or propaganda activities. Instead, they discovered something that defied their understanding of how enemies were supposed to behave toward each other. The services had evolved into something neither American nor German, but somehow both. Reverend Crawford had begun incorporating Lutheran traditions that the German prisoners suggested, while the prisoners learned Methodist hymns that were new to their experience. The language barrier dissolved as men discovered that faith spoke in ways that transcended words. Klaus found himself looking forward to Sunday evenings with an anticipation that confused him. He had convinced himself that his father's God had abandoned the world to its violence, that prayer was nothing more than wishful thinking in the face of human brutality. Yet something about these gatherings challenged his carefully constructed cynicism. It was Sergeant Hayes who first approached Klaus directly about his musical abilities. The American Guard had noticed that Klaus sang with particular skill, his voice carrying melodies with a precision that suggested formal training. When Hayes learned that Klaus had served as a choir director in his village church before the war, he made a proposal that would change everything. The camp had acquired an old upright piano for the recreation hall, donated by a local church whose congregation had purchased a newer instrument. Hayes suggested that Klaus might accompany the hymn singing, providing musical leadership for the growing congregation of prisoners and guards who attended the weekly services. The proposal created a crisis of conscience for Klaus that kept him awake for nights. Accepting Hayes's offer would mean acknowledging that these chapel services had become meaningful to him. It would require him to step forward as a leader in activities that bridged the gap between captive and captor. Most challenging of all, It would force him to confront the possibility that his faith might not be as dead as he had convinced himself. Klaus's fellow prisoners were divided in their reactions to Hayes's proposal. Some saw it as an opportunity for Klaus to gain favor with the American authorities, potentially improving conditions for all the German prisoners. Others viewed it as collaboration with the enemy, a betrayal of their duty to maintain solidarity against their captors. The debate that followed revealed the complex emotions that the chapel services had stirred among the prisoner population. For some men, the Sunday evening gatherings represented a dangerous softening of their resolve, a weakening of the hatred that they believed was necessary to survive captivity with dignity. For others, the services offered the first genuine hope they had experienced since their capture, a reminder that humanity could survive even in the midst of total war. Klaus spent 3 days wrestling with his decision before finally approaching Hayes with his answer. He would serve as the chapel pianist, but only under certain conditions. The hymns they sang must be chosen for their spiritual content rather than their political implications. The services must remain truly voluntary, with no pressure on anyone to attend. Most importantly, the music must serve the purpose of worship rather than entertainment or cultural performance. Hayes agreed to these conditions immediately, recognizing that Klaus's requirements reflected a seriousness of purpose that went far beyond mere accommodation. The American sergeant had his own reasons for wanting the chapel services to succeed. His brother's death had left him questioning everything he had believed about God's justice and human goodness. The Sunday evening gatherings had become his own path toward healing. The first service with Klaus at the piano transformed the chapel experience entirely. His skilled accompaniment allowed the congregation to attempt more complex hymns, pieces that required musical leadership to perform properly. But more than technical ability, Klaus brought an emotional depth to the music that elevated the entire worship experience. When he played "How Great Thou Art," his interpretation captured both the majesty of divine creation and the human longing for transcendence that war had nearly extinguished. When the congregation sang "Amazing Grace," Klaus's accompaniment emphasized the theme of redemption with a power that moved several men to tears. The transformation wasn't limited to the musical quality of the services. Klaus's participation seemed to give other German prisoners permission to engage more fully with the worship experience. Men who had attended, reluctantly, began volunteering to read scripture passages in their accented English. Others offered to help with practical arrangements, setting up chairs and maintaining the piano. Word of the Montana chapel services began reaching family members back home through letters that passed military censorship. American guards wrote to wives and parents about the unexpected friendships they had formed with German prisoners through shared worship. German prisoners described to their families a kind of treatment they had never expected from their captors, mentioning American guards who had become something approaching friends. These letters created ripple effects that extended far beyond Camp Ellis. Families on both sides of the Atlantic began to understand that the enemy soldiers they had been taught to hate were human beings capable of faith, doubt, hope, and despair, just like themselves. The chapel services were challenging fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare and the possibility of reconciliation between enemies. But the most profound transformation was happening within Klaus Richter himself. As he played hymn after hymn, week after week, he found that the music was doing something to his soul that he had thought impossible. The melodies that had once reminded him of innocence lost were beginning to suggest the possibility of innocence restored. His conversations with Sergeant Hayes evolved from polite exchanges about musical arrangements to deeper discussions about faith, loss, and the search for meaning in the aftermath of trauma. Hayes shared his struggle to reconcile his brother's death with his belief in a loving God. Klaus described the guilt he carried from actions he had taken as a soldier, decisions that haunted his sleep and poisoned his waking hours. These conversations revealed that both men were fighting the same battle against despair, though they wore different uniforms and spoke different languages. War had wounded them in similar ways, creating a kinship that transcended the artificial divisions of nationality and allegiance. As December approached and the Montana winter deepened around Camp Ellis, the chapel services had become the emotional and spiritual center of the entire facility. Men who had initially attended out of curiosity now planned their weeks around Sunday evening worship. The recreation hall that had once hosted poker games and letter writing was transformed each week into sacred space where enemies discovered their common humanity. The hymn that would change everything was still weeks away, but Klaus could feel something building in these weekly gatherings. The music was preparing both him and his fellow worshippers for a moment of grace that would redefine their understanding of forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of peace in a world torn apart by war. Apart by war. The transformation Klaus was experiencing wasn't lost on his fellow prisoners. Hans Mueller, a former theology student from Hamburg who had been captured alongside Klaus at Normandy, began joining their conversations about faith and forgiveness. Hans had watched his friend's gradual change with a mixture of hope and concern, recognizing the signs of someone wrestling with profound spiritual questions. Hans had his own reasons for being drawn to the chapel services. Before the war, he had been preparing for ordination in the German Lutheran Church, planning to follow in the footsteps of theologians who had shaped his understanding of Christianity's role in modern society. But military service had confronted him with moral choices that seminary training had never addressed. He had seen chaplains blessing weapons and invoking God's favor for military victories that left thousands dead. The Montana chapel offered something different from the militarized Christianity Hans had encountered during his service. Here, faith seemed divorced from nationalism, worship separated from warfare. American and German voices joined together in hymns that spoke of peace rather than victory, of healing rather than conquest. As Klaus's piano playing became more confident and expressive, he began experimenting with arrangements that blended American and German musical traditions. He would take a familiar Methodist hymn and incorporate harmonic progressions from Lutheran chorales, creating musical conversations between the two traditions that reflected the cultural exchange happening in the congregation itself. Sergeant Hayes noticed these musical innovations and encouraged Klaus to continue developing them. The American Guard had grown up in a musical family where his mother played piano for their local church, and he recognized artistry when he heard it. But more than technical skill, Hayes appreciated how Klaus's arrangements seemed to speak to the deepest needs of their unusual congregation. The winter of 1944 was particularly harsh in Montana, with temperatures dropping well below zero and snow accumulating in drifts that reached the windows of the camp buildings. The extreme weather created a sense of shared hardship that further broke down barriers between guards and prisoners. Everyone was cold. Everyone was dealing with the challenges of heating and maintaining aging facilities. Everyone was longing for spring. It was during one of these bitter cold Sunday evenings in late December that Klaus first played the hymn that would change his life forever. The congregation had been smaller than usual due to a flu outbreak that had swept through the camp, leaving many men bedridden. Those who did attend seemed subdued, worn down by illness, cold, and the grinding routine of captivity. Reverend Crawford had chosen to focus his sermon on the theme of hope in the midst of darkness, drawing from the traditional Christmas message of light coming into the world. But his words seemed to fall flat in the cold recreation hall, unable to penetrate the gloom that had settled over the small gathering. Klaus sensed the congregation's mood and made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of the planned closing hymn, he began playing a piece that came from somewhere deeper than memory or training. His fingers found melodies that seemed to emerge from the piano itself, harmonies that spoke of longing and loss, of faith tested and somehow sustained. The music that filled the hall was neither fully American nor German, but something entirely new. Klaus wove together fragments of Silent Night with themes from O Come, "O Come Emmanuel," creating a musical prayer that spoke to the universal human need for comfort and connection. The melody rose and fell like a conversation between hope and despair, each phrase building on the last, until the entire piece became a meditation on the possibility of peace in a world at war. The congregation listened in stunned silence as Klaus played, many men closing their eyes and allowing the music to wash over them like a benediction. When he finally brought the piece to its quiet conclusion, the silence that followed was profound and sacred, broken only by the sound of wind against the windows and the distant hum of the camp's generators. Sergeant Hayes was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. He asked Klaus what they had just heard, whether it was a traditional German carol or something else entirely. Klaus struggled to find words to explain what had happened at the piano. He described how the music had seemed to play itself, how melodies had emerged that he had never consciously composed, but that felt as familiar as his own heartbeat. Hans Mueller recognized something in his friend's description that connected to theological concepts they had discussed during their seminary years. He suggested that what Klaus had experienced might be what mystics called divine inspiration, moments when human creativity became a channel for something larger than individual expression. The conversation that followed stretched well past the usual closing time for chapel services. Men who would normally have returned to their barracks to write letters or play cards instead remained in the recreation hall, drawn into discussions about the nature of faith, the possibility of divine communication through music, and the meaning of the experience they had just shared. Klaus found himself at the center of these conversations, trying to articulate feelings and insights that seemed to exist just beyond the reach of language. He described how playing the unnamed hymn had felt like coming home after years of wandering, like finding a voice he had thought was lost forever. The music had seemed to emerge from some deep place within him that had survived the war intact, a part of his soul that remained connected to the divine despite everything he had witnessed and done. Word of that evening's service spread through the camp with unusual speed. Men who had never shown interest in religious activities began asking about the chapel services. Guards who had been skeptical of the entire program started attending, drawn by reports of something extraordinary happening in the recreation hall on Sunday evenings. Colonel Morrison received detailed reports about the growing impact of the chapel program on camp morale and discipline. His initial concerns about security risks had proven unfounded. If anything, the Sunday evening services seemed to be contributing to better relationships between guards and prisoners, reducing tensions that might otherwise have led to conflicts or escape attempts. But Morrison was also aware that the chapel services had begun attracting attention from outside the camp. Military officials from other prisoner facilities were requesting information about Montana's program. Religious leaders from surrounding communities were asking to visit and observe these unusual worship services. Even some reporters had begun making inquiries about the story of enemies worshiping together in the Montana wilderness. The colonel understood that Camp Ellis was walking a fine line between humanitarian innovation and potential controversy. The war was still raging, with American casualties mounting in the Pacific and European theaters. Public opinion about prisoner treatment remained complex, with many Americans believing that enemy soldiers deserved no more than basic survival needs. Yet the evidence of the chapel program's positive effects was undeniable. Prisoner cooperation with work details had improved significantly. Incidents of conflict between guards and prisoners had decreased markedly. Most importantly, the overall atmosphere of the camp had become more humane and manageable, benefiting everyone involved in the facility's daily operations. Klaus continued to develop his musical arrangements, creating pieces that drew from an increasingly wide range of traditions. He began incorporating melodies from Catholic hymns, Eastern Orthodox chants, and even Jewish liturgical music that he remembered from his university studies. Each Sunday evening brought new musical explorations that reflected the growing spiritual sophistication of their worship community. The unnamed hymn that had emerged during that cold December evening became a regular part of their services, though Klaus never played it exactly the same way twice. Each performance seemed to reveal new layers of meaning, new harmonic possibilities that reflected the continuing evolution of his own spiritual journey. Hans Mueller began serving as an informal theological advisor to the group, helping both German prisoners and American guards navigate questions about faith that arose from their shared worship experiences. His seminary training provided a framework for understanding the theological implications of their interfaith cooperation, while his own spiritual struggles gave him credibility with men who were wrestling with similar doubts and questions. The conversations that followed each service became as important as the formal worship itself. Men shared stories from their pre-war lives, describing the role that faith had played in their families and communities. They discussed how war had challenged their beliefs, how captivity had created space for reflection that combat had made impossible. These discussions revealed the complex ways that faith intersects with national identity, personal morality, and human relationships. German prisoners spoke about the tension between Christian teachings and military orders, describing moments when they had been forced to choose between obedience and conscience. American guards shared their own struggles with reconciling their faith with the violence of warfare, the challenge of maintaining Christian love while serving in an army dedicated to defeating enemies. As winter gave way to early spring, the chapel services had become something that none of its organizers had initially envisioned. What had begun as a simple accommodation to prisoner religious needs had evolved into a profound experiment in human reconciliation, a weekly demonstration that enemies could discover their common humanity even in the midst of total war. Klaus Richter had found something in that Montana chapel that he had thought was lost forever. His faith had not returned in its original form, but had been reborn as something deeper and more resilient. The music that flowed from his fingers each Sunday evening carried messages of hope that transcended the boundaries of language, nationality, and ideology. But the most transformative moments were still ahead. The hymn that would complete Klaus's spiritual journey was waiting for the right moment, the perfect convergence of circumstances that would allow grace to work its full miracle in the life of one young German soldier whose heart had been prepared by months of unexpected worship in an unlikely place. The spring of 1945 would bring news of the war's approaching end, creating new challenges and opportunities for the men who had discovered brotherhood in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. The chapel that had become their sanctuary would soon face its greatest test, and the music that had united them would prove whether the bonds they had forged were strong enough to survive the return of peace. The spring of 1945 brought with it a restlessness that settled over Camp Ellis like morning fog. News from the European theater suggested that Germany's defeat was no longer a matter of if, but when. Radio reports filtered through the camp's administrative offices, carrying updates about Allied advances that brought the war closer to its inevitable conclusion with each passing day. For the German prisoners, this news created a complex mixture of emotions that defied simple categorization. Relief that the killing might finally end warred with anxiety about what awaited them in a defeated homeland. Many had not received letters from family members in months. They had no way of knowing whether their villages still existed, whether their loved ones had survived the bombing campaigns and advancing armies that were reshaping the map of Europe. Klaus found himself caught between hope and dread as he contemplated the prospect of eventual repatriation. The man who would return to Germany bore little resemblance to the bitter soldier who had arrived at Camp Ellis the previous year. The chapel services had fundamentally altered his understanding of faith, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption, even in the aftermath of unthinkable violence. But would this transformation survive the return to a world that had been torn apart by 6 years of total war? Could the peace he had discovered in the Montana wilderness translate to the devastated landscape of post-war Germany? These questions haunted his quiet moments and influenced the music that flowed from his fingers during Sunday evening worship. Sergeant Hayes was grappling with his own uncertainties as the war neared its end. His duties at Camp Ellis had provided him with purpose and meaning that had helped him process his brother's death and his own complicated feelings about military service. The relationships he had formed with German prisoners, particularly Klaus, had challenged his preconceptions about enemies and opened his heart to possibilities he had never imagined. The thought of the camp's eventual closure filled Hayes with a sadness that surprised him with its intensity. These men who had been his charges had become something approaching friends. The Sunday evening services had created bonds that transcended the artificial boundaries of captivity and nationality. Yet military necessity would soon scatter them to different continents, different lives, different futures that might never intersect again. Reverend Crawford had watched the chapel program evolve from an experimental accommodation into something that resembled the early Christian communities described in the New Testament. Men from different backgrounds, speaking different languages, carrying different wounds, had discovered their common humanity through shared worship and mutual vulnerability. The Reverend had begun documenting the chapel experience in detailed journals, sensing that he was witnessing something historically significant that deserved to be preserved for future generations. His weekly entries described not only the formal worship services, but the countless informal conversations, the gradual breaking down of prejudices, the slow healing of hearts that had been hardened by years of violence. One particular entry from early April captured the essence of what had transpired in that modest recreation hall. Today Klaus played a variation of "Be Thou My Vision" that incorporated melodic elements from a German chorale I had never heard before. As he played, I watched the faces of both American guards and German prisoners, seeing the same expression of peace and longing reflected in eyes that had witnessed too much of humanity's capacity for destruction. In this moment, I understood that we had discovered something that transcends the divisions that politicians and generals create between peoples. We had found the kingdom of heaven, not as a distant promise, but as a present reality available to anyone willing to set aside hatred in favor of love. The music that Klaus created during these spring weeks reflected his growing confidence in his artistic abilities and his deepening spiritual insights. He began experimenting with compositions that told stories without words, musical narratives that captured the journey from despair to hope that he and his fellow worshippers had traveled together. One piece that became particularly meaningful to the congregation was his arrangement of "Abide with Me," which he transformed from a simple hymn of petition into a complex meditation on the presence of the divine in the midst of human suffering. Klaus would begin the piece with a stark, almost harsh statement of the melody, reflecting the raw pain of loss and abandonment. Gradually, he would introduce harmonic variations that suggested comfort arriving slowly, the way dawn creeps across a dark landscape. By the piece's conclusion, the original melody had been transformed into something that carried both the weight of sorrow and the lightness of hope, both the reality of human suffering and the possibility of divine consolation. Men who heard this arrangement often found themselves moved to tears by its emotional honesty and spiritual depth. Hans Mueller had become Klaus's closest collaborator in developing the theological framework that gave structure to their worship experiences. The former theology student helped his friend understand how the music he was creating connected to centuries of Christian mystical tradition, how artistic expression had always served as a bridge between the human and divine realms. Their conversations during the week often centered on the relationship between beauty and truth, between aesthetic experience and spiritual revelation. Hans would share insights from theologians like Augustine and Aquinas about the role of music in worship, while Klaus would describe the inner experience of allowing melodies to emerge from some source deeper, than conscious thought. These discussions attracted other prisoners who had intellectual backgrounds in philosophy, literature, and the arts. The chapel program had become a magnet for men who were seeking meaning beyond the basic survival needs that military captivity typically addressed. German prisoners who had been professors, artists, and clergy before the war found in the Sunday evening services a community of serious discourse about questions that mattered more than daily routines or work assignments. The American guards who participated in these conversations brought their own perspectives on faith, art, and the search for meaning. Many had grown up in rural communities where practical concerns took precedence over abstract philosophical discussions. But the chapel services had opened them to ways of thinking about spirituality that went beyond the simple moral lessons they had learned in childhood Sunday schools. Sergeant Hayes found himself reading books that German prisoners recommended, exploring theological and philosophical works that challenged his assumptions about the relationship between faith and reason. Klaus had introduced him to the writings of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German pastor and theologian, whose opposition to Nazism had cost him his life just weeks before the war's end. Bonhoeffer's ideas about religionless Christianity and the need for faith to engage with the world's suffering rather than retreat into otherworldly piety resonated deeply with Hayes's own spiritual journey. The American sergeant had discovered that true faith required wrestling with difficult questions rather than accepting easy answers, confronting the reality of evil rather than pretending it didn't exist. As April progressed toward May, reports from Europe became increasingly frequent and detailed. The liberation of concentration camps had begun revealing the full scope of Nazi atrocities, creating a new context for understanding the war's moral dimensions. These revelations forced everyone at Camp Ellis to confront uncomfortable questions about collective responsibility, individual guilt, and the possibility of forgiveness in the face of unimaginable crimes. The German prisoners received this news with reactions that ranged from shock to denial to profound shame. Many had served in regular military units and claimed ignorance of the systematic murder that had been conducted in their nation's name. Others admitted to having heard rumors or witnessed actions that they had chosen not to investigate too closely. A few acknowledged direct knowledge of atrocities while maintaining that they had been powerless to prevent them. Klaus found himself grappling with questions that went to the heart of his spiritual transformation. How could he claim redemption while his countrymen had committed such horrors? Was it possible to separate individual guilt from collective responsibility? Could forgiveness extend to crimes so massive and systematic that they seemed to exceed the boundaries of human comprehension? The chapel services during this period took on a different character as participants struggled to process information that challenged their understanding of human nature and divine justice. Reverend Crawford's sermons focused on biblical accounts of judgment and mercy, exploring how communities had historically dealt with the aftermath of great evil. Klaus's music during these weeks reflected the emotional turmoil that gripped the entire camp community. His arrangements became more complex and dissonant, incorporating musical elements that suggested struggle and unresolved tension. Yet even in pieces that acknowledged the reality of human evil, he found ways to suggest the possibility of redemption, the hope that grace might somehow be sufficient even for the worst of human failures. One Sunday evening in late April, as news of Hitler's suicide reached the camp and German prisoners began to understand that their nation's defeat was now complete, Klaus made a decision that would define the remainder of his time at Camp Ellis. Instead of his planned musical arrangement, he began playing a piece that he had never performed for any audience, a composition that had emerged from his private prayers during the darkest moments of his captivity. The music that filled the recreation hall that evening was unlike anything Klaus had previously shared with the congregation. It began with a statement of profound lament, melodies that seemed to carry the weight of all human suffering, all the tears that had been shed during 6 years of global warfare. The harmonies were complex and sometimes harsh, refusing to offer easy comfort in the face of genuine tragedy. But as the piece developed, Klaus began introducing elements that suggested the possibility of healing without denying the reality of wounds. Melodic lines that had begun in despair slowly transformed into something that might have been hope, though it was hope that had been earned through suffering rather than granted as a simple gift. The congregation listened in complete silence as Klaus played, many men closing their eyes and allowing the music to carry them through their own internal journeys from anger to sorrow, to something that might eventually become peace. When the piece finally concluded, the silence that followed was so profound that it seemed to have weight and substance of its own. Sergeant Hayes was the first to break that silence, though his voice was barely audible when he asked Klaus about the piece they had just heard. Klaus struggled to find words to describe music that had emerged from places in his soul that he was still exploring. He spoke about the need to acknowledge darkness before seeking light, about the importance of honest grief as a prerequisite for genuine healing. The conversation that followed lasted well into the night, with men sharing their own experiences of loss and their struggles to find meaning in the aftermath of trauma. American guards spoke about friends who had died in distant battles. German prisoners described the destruction of their homeland and their fears about what awaited them upon their return. But they also talked about what they had discovered together in the chapel services, about the relationships that had formed across lines of nationality and ideology. They spoke about the music that had become their common language, the hymns that had taught them to see each other as fellow human beings rather than enemies defined by uniform and circumstance. As May arrived and brought with it Germany's formal surrender, the men of Camp Ellis understood that their unique experiment in wartime reconciliation was approaching its end. The chapel services had created something precious and fragile, a community of former enemies who had discovered their common humanity through shared worship and mutual vulnerability. The hymn that would complete Klaus's transformation was still waiting for the perfect moment to emerge, but the foundation had been laid through months of musical exploration and spiritual growth. When that moment finally arrived, it would reveal the full power of grace to heal even the deepest wounds and transform even the hardest hearts. Klaus awoke on May 8, 1945, to the sound of church bells ringing across the Montana Valley. The news had arrived before dawn through crackling radio transmissions that carried words many had waited years to hear. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The celebration that erupted among the American personnel was subdued but genuine. Guards who had lost brothers and friends in foreign battles allowed themselves moments of quiet satisfaction, knowing that the killing had finally stopped. But for the German prisoners, the news brought a complex mixture of relief and uncertainty that settled over the camp like a heavy blanket. Klaus found himself walking the perimeter fence in the early morning light, trying to process emotions that seemed too large for his chest to contain. The war that had defined his entire adult life was over, but what came next remained a mystery wrapped in anxiety and hope in equal measure. He thought about his parents in Bavaria, wondering if their village still existed, if the church where his father had preached still stood among the ruins of the Third Reich. Sergeant Hayes discovered Klaus by the fence and joined him in his contemplative walk. The two men had developed a friendship that transcended their official roles as guard and prisoner, built on months of shared worship and countless conversations about faith, music, and the search for meaning in the aftermath of trauma. Now they faced the prospect of separation, as military necessity would soon scatter the camp's population to different continents and different destinies. The conversation that morning was unlike any they had shared before. Hayes spoke about his plans to return to civilian life, his hope of using his military experience to find work that felt meaningful and constructive. Klaus described his uncertainty about returning to a Germany he might no longer recognize, his fear that the peace he had found in Montana would not survive transplantation to European soil still soaked with the blood of 6 years of warfare. But they also talked about what they had discovered together in the chapel services, about the relationships that had formed across enemy lines, and the music that had become their common language. Hayes admitted that the Sunday evening worship had changed his understanding of Christianity from a set of rules to be followed into a way of being present with others in their suffering and their hope. Klaus nodded, recognizing in his friend's words an echo of his own spiritual journey. The chapel had taught him that faith was not about having the right answers, but about remaining open to grace even when circumstances suggested that God had abandoned the world to its violence. The music that had flowed through his fingers each Sunday had been both prayer and answer, both question and response to questions too deep for ordinary language. The days following Germany's surrender brought a flurry of administrative activity, as military officials began planning for the eventual repatriation of prisoners. Forms were distributed requiring detailed information about family members, home addresses, and professional qualifications that would help authorities determine where each man should be sent in the reconstruction of Europe. Klaus filled out his paperwork with mechanical precision, but his mind remained focused on more immediate concerns. The chapel services had continued even as the war ended, perhaps becoming more important as men grappled with the transition from captivity to an uncertain freedom. The music had become their anchor in a world that seemed to shift beneath their feet with each passing day. Reverend Crawford had announced that he would continue conducting services for as long as the camp remained operational, recognizing that the men needed spiritual guidance during this liminal period between war and peace. But everyone understood that their unique community was temporary, that the forces of history and military necessity would soon tear apart what they had built together in that modest recreation hall. It was during this period of transition and uncertainty that Klaus began working on what would become his masterpiece, though he had no way of knowing at the time that he was creating something that would outlive all of them. The composition emerged gradually during his private practice sessions at the piano, fragments of melody that seemed to carry the weight of everything he had experienced and learned during his months at Camp Ellis. The piece began with musical themes that reflected his arrival at the camp, bitter and angry melodies that captured the despair of a young man whose faith had been shattered by war. But as the composition developed, Klaus began incorporating the hymns that had become familiar during the chapel services, weaving together American and German musical traditions into something that belonged fully to neither culture while honoring both. Hans Mueller was the first to hear Klaus play through the complete composition during one of their evening conversations. The former theology student recognized immediately that his friend had created something extraordinary, a musical autobiography that told the story not just of one man's spiritual journey, but of the entire chapel community's transformation from enemies into brothers. The piece lasted nearly 15 minutes in its complete form, moving through distinct sections that corresponded to different phases of Klaus's experience at Camp Ellis. The opening movement captured his initial bitterness and isolation, using dissonant harmonies and fragmented melodies that suggested a soul at war with itself and the world. The second movement introduced the hymn melodies that had become central to the chapel services, but presented them in conversation with the darker themes from the opening section. This musical dialogue represented Klaus's gradual opening to the possibility that faith might survive even in the aftermath of overwhelming trauma and moral failure. The third movement was the most complex, incorporating musical elements from both American and German traditions while creating something entirely new. Klaus had found ways to make Methodist hymns speak with Lutheran harmonies, to let American folk melodies carry German theological insights about the nature of grace and redemption. The final movement brought all these musical threads together in a statement of hope that acknowledged darkness without being overwhelmed by it. The piece concluded not with triumphant celebration but with quiet confidence the kind of peace that comes only after honest confrontation with the worst that human beings can do to each other. Word of Klaus's composition spread quickly through the camp, generating excitement and curiosity among both prisoners and guards. Men who had participated in the chapel services understood that Klaus had created something that captured the essence of their shared experience, while those who had remained skeptical found themselves drawn to music that seemed to speak directly to their own unspoken struggles with faith and forgiveness. Colonel Morrison requested a private performance of the piece, recognizing that Klaus had created something that might be historically significant. The commanding officer had watched the chapel program evolve from experimental accommodation into something that resembled the kind of reconciliation that would be necessary for Europe's post-war reconstruction. Klaus's composition seemed to embody that process of healing in musical form. The performance took place in Morrison's office on a Thursday evening in late May, with only the Colonel, Reverend Crawford, and Sergeant Hayes present as witnesses. Klaus played the complete piece on the Colonel's personal piano, a beautiful Steinway that had belonged to the facility's previous incarnation as a private estate. The music filled the office with emotional power that surprised even Klaus himself. Playing the composition in its entirety for the first time since completing it, he discovered layers of meaning that had been hidden during the process of creation. The piece told not just his own story, but the story of every man who had participated in the chapel services, every guard and prisoner who had discovered unexpected brotherhood through shared worship. When Klaus finished playing, the silence that followed was profound and reverent. Colonel Morrison, a career military officer who prided himself on maintaining professional distance from the men under his command, found himself moved to tears by music that captured the full complexity of human experience during wartime. Reverend Crawford spoke first, his voice heavy with emotion as he described what he had just witnessed. The chaplain recognized that Klaus had created something that transcended mere artistic expression, a musical prayer that spoke to the deepest questions about suffering, redemption, and the possibility of hope in the aftermath of unimaginable loss. Sergeant Hayes remained silent for several minutes after the music ended, processing emotions that seemed too large for words. Finally, he asked Klaus whether the piece had a title, whether there was a name that captured its meaning and significance. Klaus admitted that he had not considered the question, that the music had emerged from places in his soul that existed beyond language and rational thought. It was Colonel Morrison who suggested the title that would eventually become associated with Klaus's composition. Looking at the young German pianist with something approaching paternal affection, the Colonel proposed that the piece be called Montana Hymn, recognizing both its geographic origins and its spiritual significance. The name felt right to everyone present, capturing the way that the vast Montana landscape had provided space for the kind of spiritual growth that would have been impossible in the confined circumstances of ordinary military captivity. The hymn belonged to the place where it had been created, but it also spoke to universal human experiences that transcended geographic boundaries. Plans began immediately for a public performance of the Montana Hymn, though the logistics proved more complex than anyone had anticipated. Word of Klaus's composition had reached military officials in Washington, who saw potential propaganda value in a story about enemy prisoners finding redemption through American hospitality and Christian fellowship. But Klaus resisted attempts to politicize his music, insisting that the hymn's meaning could not be reduced to simple messages about American virtue or German repentance. The composition had emerged from genuine spiritual experience, not from desire to serve any political agenda. Its power lay in its honest exploration of human brokenness and the possibility of healing, themes that could not be packaged for public consumption without destroying their essential truth. The compromise that emerged satisfied everyone while protecting the integrity of Klaus's artistic vision. The Montana Hymn would receive its premiere performance during a final chapel service that would mark the end of the camp's religious program. The service would be open to the entire camp population, both guards and prisoners, but would not be publicized beyond the immediate community that had participated in its creation. Preparations for this farewell service consumed the final weeks of May as men who had found meaning in the Sunday evening gatherings prepared to say goodbye to something that had changed their lives in fundamental ways. The recreation hall was decorated with wildflowers that prisoners had gathered from the surrounding prairie, creating an atmosphere that felt both celebratory and solemn. Klaus spent hours preparing for the performance, not just practicing the technical aspects of the composition, but preparing himself emotionally and spiritually for what he knew would be the most important musical moment of his life. The Montana hymn represented everything he had learned about faith, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption during his months of captivity. Playing it would be both artistic performance and personal testimony, both musical expression and spiritual declaration. The evening arrived with perfect Montana weather, clear skies that stretched endlessly toward horizons that seemed to promise infinite possibility. Men began gathering in the recreation hall well before the scheduled start time, understanding that they were about to participate in something that none of them would ever forget. Klaus took his place at the piano as the hall filled with every member of the camp community, German prisoners and American guards sitting together, without regard for the military protocols that had once divided them. Reverend Crawford offered a brief prayer of gratitude for the fellowship they had shared and the insights they had gained through their time together. Then Klaus began to play, and the Montana hymn filled the hall with music that seemed to contain the essence of everything they had experienced together. The composition carried listeners through the full journey from despair to hope, from bitterness to forgiveness, from isolation to community. It spoke without words about the possibility of grace, even in the aftermath of humanity's worst failures. As Klaus played, men throughout the hall found themselves reliving their own spiritual journeys, remembering the moments when they had first allowed themselves to see enemies as human beings worthy of compassion and respect. The music became a shared meditation on the mystery of transformation, the way that hearts hardened by war could somehow learn to beat with rhythms of peace. When the piece reached its conclusion, the silence that followed seemed to contain all the prayers that could not be spoken, all the gratitude that exceeded the capacity of language to express. Men who had discovered brotherhood across enemy lines knew that they were witnessing the end of something precious and unrepeatable, a moment of grace that had emerged from the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. The hymn that changed Klaus Richter's life had found its voice at last, carrying a message of hope that would echo far beyond the walls of one Montana prisoner of war camp. In the years to come, copies of the Montana hymn would find their way to churches across America and Europe, reminding congregations that the possibility of reconciliation exists even in humanity's darkest hours. But that evening in May 1945, as Klaus rose from the piano bench and looked out at faces reflecting the same peace he had found through months of unexpected worship, the future seemed less important than the present moment of perfect understanding between men who had learned to see the image of God in one another's eyes. Klaus remained at the piano for several moments after the final notes of the Montana hymn had faded into silence, his hands still resting on the keys, as if reluctant to break the connection that had carried him through the most meaningful performance of his life. The recreation hall held its collective breath, 200 men suspended in a moment that felt both eternal and impossibly fragile. When applause finally erupted, it came not as the polite acknowledgement typical of formal concerts, but as something deeper and more primal. These were men expressing gratitude for having witnessed the birth of something sacred, for being present at the moment when one human soul had found its voice and used it to speak truths that transcended the boundaries of language, nationality, and ideology. Sergeant Hayes was among the first to approach the piano, his face reflecting the same mixture of joy and sorrow that Klaus had felt while playing. The American guard extended his hand to the German prisoner, and their handshake became an embrace that symbolized everything the chapel program had accomplished. Two men who should have been enemies had become brothers through the mysterious alchemy of shared worship and mutual vulnerability. Hans Mueller followed, his theological training giving him words for what others could only feel. He spoke quietly to Klaus about the way the Montana hymn had captured the essence of Christian transformation, the journey from death to resurrection that lay at the heart of all genuine spiritual experience. The music had become a form of testimony more powerful than any sermon, more convincing than any theological argument. Colonel Morrison approached the piano with unprecedented emotion visible in his typically composed demeanor. The career military officer had overseen dozens of prisoner facilities during his service, but nothing had prepared him for the transformation he had witnessed at Camp Ellis. The Montana hymn represented everything he hoped might be possible in the post-war world, a demonstration that former enemies could find common ground through shared recognition of their fundamental humanity. Reverend Crawford struggled to find words adequate to the moment as he joined the small group gathered around Klaus. The chaplain had conducted thousands of worship services during his ministry, but none had moved him more deeply than this farewell gathering in a converted recreation hall. The Montana hymn had achieved something that formal theology often failed to accomplish, creating space for genuine encounter between human souls and the divine mystery that connected them all. The conversations that followed stretched deep into the night as men who had been transformed by their chapel experience tried to process what they had witnessed and shared. German prisoners spoke about their plans for returning home, their hopes for rebuilding lives in a nation that would need to confront its own moral failures while somehow finding the strength to begin again. American guards discussed their own futures with new awareness of how their military service had changed them. Many had entered the war with clear convictions about good and evil, right and wrong, us and them. The chapel program had complicated those certainties in ways that would influence their approach to civilian life, their relationships with family and community, their understanding of what it meant to serve something larger than themselves. Klaus found himself at the center of these conversations, though he struggled to articulate the transformation he had experienced during his months at Camp Ellis. The angry, bitter young man who had arrived in Montana bearing wounds that went far deeper than physical scars had been replaced by someone capable of creating beauty from suffering, hope from despair, connection from isolation. The Montana hymn had become both the expression of that transformation and its completion. In creating music that spoke to the deepest human needs for meaning and reconciliation, Klaus had discovered his own purpose beyond the narrow confines of nationality and ideology. He was no longer simply a German soldier or an American prisoner, but a human being whose gifts could serve the universal longing for peace. As the evening wound toward its conclusion, practical concerns began to intrude on the spiritual celebration. Administrative notices reminded everyone that the camp's closure was imminent, that repatriation processes would begin within days. The community that had formed around the Sunday evening chapel services would soon scatter to different continents, different languages, different futures that might never intersect again. Yet something had been planted during those months of shared worship that would prove impossible to uproot. The men who had discovered brotherhood across enemy lines carried within themselves proof that reconciliation was possible, that the deepest human divisions could be healed through patient cultivation of understanding and mutual respect. Klaus Richter returned to a Germany he barely recognized, carrying within him melodies that would outlive every politician and general who had started that terrible war. The chapel at Camp Ellis was dismantled. The recreation hall returned to its mundane purposes, but the music lived on. In small churches across 2 continents, congregations still sing variations of the Montana hymn, though few know the story of its creation. Sometimes the most powerful transformations happen not on battlefields or in government halls, but in the quiet moments when one human heart recognizes another across the deepest divides imaginable.